There is a version of you that you have never met. It walks a step behind you, made of everything you decided, at some point, you were not allowed to be. The anger you swallowed, the selfishness you were ashamed of, the desires you learned to deny before you even understood them. You did not destroy these things, you only stopped looking at them, and whatever a person refuses to look at does not disappear. It waits. He called this hidden companion the shadow, and he spent much of his life arguing that a person cannot become whole while pretending it isn't there. Jung's theory of the shadow begins with a simple, uncomfortable observation about how a personality forms. As children, we quickly learn that certain feelings and impulses are unwelcome. Anger that upsets a parent, selfishness that draws punishment, desires that provoke shame. We don't eliminate these impulses. We can't. Instead, we push them out of conscious awareness into a part of the psyche Jung believed operates largely outside our control. The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality. Everything that gets pushed into that space doesn't vanish. It accumulates. Over years, it becomes what Jung called the shadow, not evil in itself, simply unacknowledged. Everything about ourselves we've decided doesn't fit the person we're presenting to the world. And the less consciously a person deals with it, the more powerfully it tends to operate from underneath. It's worth being precise here, because the word shadow gets used loosely, often reduced to simply mean your dark side in a vague, gothic sense. Jung's definition was more specific and in some ways more unsettling. The shadow is not simply the capacity for evil, it's everything about the self that the conscious ego has rejected as incompatible with its own self-image, which means the shadow can contain qualities that aren't inherently bad at all, only unacceptable to the particular identity a person has built. A person raised to believe that anger is shameful may bury their anger in the shadow, even when that anger is entirely justified. A person taught that ambition is arrogant may bury their own healthy drive to achieve. A person told that their needs are a burden may bury the simple, human desire to be cared for. The shadow isn't a catalog of sins, it's a catalog of exile, everything a person's conscious identity decided it could not afford to include. Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. This is the mechanism worth sitting with. The shadow doesn't grow because a person is secretly wicked. It grows in direct proportion to how much a person refuses to look at it. Most discussions of the shadow stop at the traits people are ashamed of, but Jung and later Jungian analysts identified something less intuitive and in its own way just as important: the golden shadow, made up not of disowned darkness, but of disowned light. Talents, strengths, and positive qualities a person has buried just as thoroughly as their anger or greed, usually because acknowledging them once felt dangerous, arrogant, or simply not permitted. A child praised only for being modest may bury their own genuine brilliance. A child raised in a family uncomfortable with visible success may bury their own ambition or leadership. Because these qualities feel safer to disown than to claim, they often go completely unnoticed as shadow material at all, hiding in plain sight behind the more obvious, more dramatic idea that the unconscious is mainly a container for darkness. The golden shadow reveals itself through a mirror image of the same mechanism Jung described for projection. Instead of disproportionate irritation at another person's flaw, it shows up as disproportionate admiration or envy of another person's gift. The quiet, aching pull towards someone else's confidence, creativity, or charisma that feels bigger than simple appreciation. Jung's model suggests this intensity often signals a capacity the admirer has buried in themselves, not simply a trait they lack and wish they had. Integration, in this case, doesn't mean confronting something shameful. It means reclaiming permission to be as capable, as bright, or as powerful as the person being envied, without waiting for someone else's approval to claim it first. If the shadow lives in the unconscious, how does anyone ever encounter it? Jung's answer was projection, the psychological mechanism by which unacknowledged parts of ourselves get unconsciously attributed to other people instead, experienced as something we're reacting to out there, rather than something living inside us. This is why Jung considered strong, disproportionate irritation at another person's traits one of the most reliable signals available for locating a person's own shadow. Not ordinary disagreement and not measured criticism, but the kind of visceral, outsized reaction that feels bigger than the situation calls for. The colleague whose arrogance makes your blood boil, the stranger's selfishness that ruins your whole afternoon. Jung's uncomfortable claim was that this intensity is rarely only about the other person. It's frequently a sign that the trait triggering it exists inside the observer too, disowned and projected outward because it was never safe to acknowledge at home. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. This doesn't mean every criticism is secretly projection, or that real harm done by real people should be waved away as someone else's shadow work. Jung wasn't arguing that. He was pointing at something narrower, that the specific charge, the specific heat behind certain reactions often has less to do with the target and more to do with a mirror the observer doesn't recognize as a mirror. Given how uncomfortable the shadow sounds, it would be easy to assume Jung's advice was to fight it, suppress it further, or eliminate it through sheer discipline. He argued almost the opposite. Jung believed that a person who refuses to acknowledge their shadow doesn't become more virtuous. They become more dangerous to themselves and often to the people closest to them, because unacknowledged material doesn't stay passive. It looks for expression anyway, usually in a distorted, uncontrolled form, at moments the conscious mind isn't prepared for. I would rather be whole than good. This line captures something central to Jung's entire model. Wholeness, for Jung, was a higher psychological goal than a narrow, performative kind of goodness built on denial. A person who has integrated their shadow, who knows their own capacity for anger, selfishness, and darkness, and holds that knowledge consciously rather than pretending it isn't there, is paradoxically far less likely to be controlled by those forces than someone who has spent a lifetime insisting they don't exist. The goal was never elimination, it was acquaintance. In his own clinical practice, Jung repeatedly observed a consistent pattern in patients who had spent years maintaining a rigidly virtuous, controlled self-image, precisely because their anger, envy, or desire had never been consciously acknowledged. Those impulses tended to surface anyway, usually sideways, as inexplicable physical symptoms, self-sabotaging decisions, or emotional outbursts the patient themselves couldn't account for. Once the disowned material was named and consciously examined in therapy, Jung found that its grip on the patient's behavior typically loosened, not because the impulse had been defeated, but because it no longer needed to force its way into consciousness through the back door. Jung was direct about the cost of avoiding this work, both for individuals and, more disturbingly, for entire societies. On the individual level, unacknowledged shadow material tends to produce exactly the symptoms one might expect from something buried but not gone. Disproportionate outbursts that seemed to come from nowhere, self-sabotage that made no conscious sense, relationships repeatedly poisoned by patterns the person insisted they didn't recognize in themselves. But Jung's most chilling application of the concept was collective. Writing in the years surrounding the rise of fascism in Europe, in essays examining what he saw happening to his own German-speaking neighbors, Jung argued that entire populations are just as capable of denying a collective shadow as individuals are, projecting their own disowned darkness onto an enemy, a scapegoat, an outside group, allowing ordinary people to participate in atrocity while consciously believing themselves to be virtuous, precisely because their own capacity for cruelty had never been consciously acknowledged, only located safely outside themselves. This is arguably Jung's most important warning. Unclaimed darkness doesn't stay contained to a single psyche. Left unexamined at scale, it becomes something societies enact on each other, each side certain the monster belongs entirely to the other one. If elimination isn't the goal and denial is dangerous, what does Jung actually recommend? The process he described, often called shadow work in later popular psychology, begins with something deceptively simple: honest self-observation, particularly around moments of disproportionate emotional reaction, whether that's anger at someone else's flaw, an unexplainable pull toward a desire the person has always denied having, or, per the golden shadow, an aching envy of a gift in someone else that might actually belong to the observer too. Jung believed this confrontation is rarely comfortable, and he never pretended otherwise. Meeting the shadow means admitting capacities a person has spent years insisting weren't theirs. But he considered this confrontation the necessary first stage of individuation, the broader lifelong process of becoming a genuinely whole self rather than a curated, partial performance of one. A person doesn't integrate their shadow by acting out every impulse it contains. They integrate it by acknowledging that the impulse exists, understanding what it's actually asking for, and consciously choosing how, or whether, to act, rather than being blindsided by it later, in a moment they didn't choose, aimed at a target that never deserved it. Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people. This is, in some sense, Jung's entire ethical argument in a single sentence. Compassion and real moral seriousness, in his framework, don't come from a person who has convinced themselves they contain no darkness at all. They come from a person who has met their own capacity for it directly and chosen, with open eyes, not to be ruled by it. The figure walking a step behind you was never a stranger. It has your voice, your history, your name, and some of what it carries, you may find, was never darkness at all, only light you were never given permission to claim. Jung's entire argument was never that you should fear what follows you, or destroy it, or spend a lifetime running fast enough to outpace it. It was simpler and harder. Turn around, not to defeat what's there, but finally to recognize it as your own.